The flight from Chicago landed 20 minutes early at Richmond International Airport, but Robert Harrison felt as though every minute had stretched into an eternity. 3 weeks away from home had been the longest business trip of his construction empire career, and all he could think about was seeing his 8-year-old daughter Emma's bright smile when he walked through the front door of their sprawling Victorian mansion in Richmond's prestigious Monument Avenue district. As the taxi pulled up the familiar circular driveway lined with ancient oak trees, Robert noticed something unsettling. The house, which usually glowed with warm light spilling from every window, seemed strangely dim. The curtains were drawn tight against the late afternoon sun, and an unusual stillness hung over the property like a heavy blanket. Even the porch swing, where Emma loved to read her fairy tale books, sat motionless, as if waiting for life to return to it. Robert paid the driver and retrieved his leather suitcase from the trunk, his businessman's instincts already alert to the subtle wrongness of the scene before him. During his years building Harrison Construction from a small family business into one of Virginia's most successful development companies, he had learned to trust his gut feelings about situations that didn't quite add up. The key turned easily in the front door lock, but instead of the usual explosion of excitement that greeted his returns, he was met with an oppressive silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked steadily, but even that familiar sound felt different somehow, more pronounced against the unnatural quiet. "Emma? Victoria?" he called out, setting his suitcase down on the polished hardwood floor. His voice echoed through the high-ceilinged hallway, bouncing off the expensive wallpaper that Victoria had insisted on during their renovation 2 years ago. "I'm home!" No answer came, not even the sound of footsteps or muffled voices from upstairs. Robert loosened his tie and walked through the living room, noting that everything appeared to be in its proper place. The Persian rugs lay perfectly straight. The antique furniture gleamed with recent polishing, and fresh flowers sat in the crystal vase on the coffee table. Yet something fundamental felt wrong, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He thought back to the text messages Victoria had sent during his trip. They had been shorter than usual, lacking the warmth and detail that typically characterized their communications. When he had asked specifically about Emma's school activities or bedtime stories, Victoria's responses had been brief and somewhat evasive. At the time, he had attributed this to her busy schedule, managing the household, and her volunteer work with the Richmond Historical Society. Victoria Whitmore had entered their lives like a breath of fresh air 2 years ago, just when Robert had begun to despair that he would never find someone who could love both him and Emma with equal devotion. She had appeared at a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, elegant and sophisticated, with an immediate warmth toward Emma that had melted Robert's cautious heart. Her background in child psychology and her gentle manner with his daughter had seemed like a perfect match for their small family, still healing from the loss of Emma's mother 3 years earlier. The sound of a door closing somewhere in the house broke through Robert's reverie. He followed the sound toward the back of the house, past the gourmet kitchen where Victoria usually prepared Emma's favorite meals, and toward the study where he conducted business calls from home. The late afternoon light filtering through the windows cast long shadows across the hardwood floors, creating patterns that seemed to shift and move as he walked. As he approached the study, he could hear voices coming from behind the closed door. One voice was Victoria's, but it carried a tone he had never heard before, sharp and cold, completely different from the gentle cadence he had fallen in love with. The other voice was softer, almost a whisper, and it took him a moment to realize it was Emma. But this wasn't the cheerful chatter of his daughter's usual storytelling. This was something else entirely, something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Robert paused outside the study door, his hand hovering over the brass handle. Every instinct he had developed during 20 years of business negotiations told him that something significant was happening on the other side of this door, something that would change everything he thought he knew about his carefully ordered life. The house around him seemed to pulse with tension, as if the very walls were trying to warn him. The familiar sense of home, vanilla candles, and Victoria's lavender perfume now seemed cloying and artificial. Even the afternoon light streaming through the windows felt different, casting everything in stark relief rather than the warm glow he remembered. He pressed his ear closer to the door, trying to make out the words being spoken inside. Victoria's voice was saying something about rules and consequences, but her tone was nothing like the patient, educational approach she had always used with Emma before. There was an edge to it, a hardness that sent a chill down Robert's spine. Emma's voice responded so quiet he could barely hear it, and what he could catch seemed to be some kind of apology. But why would his confident, spirited daughter be apologizing in such a subdued manner? Emma had always been encouraged to express herself freely in their home, to ask questions and share her thoughts without fear of judgment. Robert's hand finally closed around the door handle, and he took a deep breath before slowly turning it. Whatever was happening in his study, whatever had changed in his house during his absence, he was about to confront it head-on. The successful businessman who had built an empire through careful planning and decisive action was about to face a situation that would test every skill he had ever developed. The door opened silently on well-oiled hinges, and Robert stepped into a scene that would forever divide his life into before and after this moment. The study, with its leather-bound books and mahogany desk, had been transformed into something unrecognizable, and in the center of it all was his daughter, looking smaller and more fragile than he had ever seen her before. Robert's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. His usually immaculate study had been rearranged in ways that made no sense. The comfortable reading chair, where Emma loved to curl up with her books, had been moved to face the corner, and his daughter sat in it with her back ramrod straight, staring at the wall. Her normally bouncy auburn curls hung limp around her shoulders, and she wore a plain grey dress he had never seen before, instead of the colourful outfits she typically chose for herself. Victoria stood behind the desk, her posture rigid and authoritative, in a way that seemed completely foreign to the woman he thought he knew. She was holding what appeared to be a small notebook, reading from it in that cold, sharp voice he had heard through the door. When she noticed Robert's presence, her entire demeanor shifted with startling speed, the harsh expression melting into the warm smile he remembered. "Robert, darling, you're home early," Victoria said, her voice instantly returning to its familiar, honeyed tone. She closed the notebook quickly and moved toward him with her arms outstretched. "We weren't expecting you until this evening." Emma didn't turn around. She remained perfectly still in the chair, as if she hadn't heard her father enter the room. This was perhaps the most shocking thing of all, because Emma had never in her life failed to run to him when he returned from a trip. She would typically launch herself into his arms with stories about school, friends, and whatever book she was currently reading. "Emma," Robert said gently, stepping around Victoria's attempted embrace. "Sweetheart, Daddy's home." Still no response. Emma continued to stare at the corner wall as if it held secrets that required her complete attention. Robert noticed that her small hands were folded precisely in her lap, and her feet were positioned perfectly parallel on the floor. Everything about her posture suggested a child who had been trained to sit in exactly this way. "She's having a time out," Victoria explained quickly, moving to position herself between Robert and Emma. "She's been quite difficult while you were away, testing boundaries and being disrespectful. I've had to implement some new structure to help her learn appropriate behavior." Robert felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. In all of Emma's 8 years, he had never known her to be disrespectful or deliberately difficult. She was naturally well-behaved, curious, and eager to please. The idea that she would suddenly become problematic seemed impossible. especially with Victoria, whom she had grown to trust and love. "What kind of boundaries?" Robert asked, his voice carefully controlled. Years of business negotiations had taught him the importance of gathering information before reacting, even when every instinct screamed at him to scoop his daughter into his arms and demand explanations. Victoria's smile flickered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, you know how children can be when routines change. She's been staying up too late, not eating her vegetables, talking back when asked to clean her room. Nothing serious, just typical childhood testing." Dr. Morrison from the behavioral clinic recommended this approach for strong-willed children. Robert had never heard Victoria mention any Dr. Morrison before, and he couldn't understand why she would consult a behavioral specialist without discussing it with him first. Emma had never shown signs of being particularly strong-willed in a problematic way. If anything, she had always been remarkably adaptable and cooperative. "Emma," he said again, moving closer to the chair. "Can you look at Daddy, please?" This time, Emma's shoulders tensed slightly, but she still didn't turn around. Robert could see her profile now, and what he observed made his chest tighten with concern. Her usually bright, expressive face looked wan and tired, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. Her lips, which normally curved upward in a ready smile, were pressed into a thin, flat line. "She needs to complete her reflection time," Victoria said firmly, placing a hand on Robert's arm. Dr. Morrison was very clear that interrupting the process would only reinforce negative behaviors. "She has 10 more minutes to think about her choices." Robert stared at Victoria, searching her face for the woman he thought he had fallen in love with. The gentle soul who had spent hours reading to Emma, who had taught her to braid friendship bracelets, who had cried with joy when Emma had started calling her Mama Victoria. This stern stranger, who spoke about his daughter as if she were a problem to be solved, bore no resemblance to that woman. "I'd like to speak with you privately," Robert said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now." Victoria's perfect composure wavered for just an instant, and in that brief moment, Robert caught a glimpse of something in her eyes that he had never seen before. It was cold and calculating, completely devoid of the warmth and love that had drawn him to her. Then, like a mask sliding back into place, her gentle expression returned. "Of course, darling. Emma, you continue your reflection. We'll be right back." As they moved toward the hallway, Robert caught Emma's eye for just a second. What he saw there nearly broke his heart. His confident, spirited daughter looked at him with an expression of desperate hope mixed with fear, as if she wanted to run to him but was afraid of the consequences. It was the look of a child who had learned that asking for help might make things worse. In the hallway, Victoria immediately began talking in rapid, soothing tones about the challenges of parenting and the importance of consistency and discipline. She explained that she had been reading extensively about child development and had consulted with experts about the best approaches for helping Emma adjust to having a stepmother figure in her life. But Robert was no longer listening to her words. Instead, he was watching her face, her gestures, the way her eyes moved when she spoke. All of his business instincts were screaming that he was being sold something, that every word was carefully calculated to convince him of a narrative that didn't align with reality. "I want to talk to Emma alone," he said, interrupting Victoria mid-sentence. "That's not a good idea right now," Victoria replied quickly. "She's in a very fragile emotional state, and disrupting the discipline process could set back all the progress we've made. Dr. Morrison specifically warned against undermining the authority figure during the adjustment period." Robert studied Victoria's face as she spoke, noting how she avoided direct eye contact when mentioning this mysterious Dr. Morrison. In all his years of business dealings, he had learned to recognize when someone was lying, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that Victoria was not telling him the truth about what had been happening in his house. The house itself seemed different now, as if he was seeing it clearly for the first time. The flowers in the crystal vase, which he had initially seen as a welcoming touch, now struck him as stagecraft, carefully arranged to create an impression of normalcy. The perfectly clean surfaces, which had seemed like evidence of Victoria's excellent housekeeping, now felt sterile and artificial. How long had this been going on? How many of Victoria's explanations for Emma's behavior had he accepted without question, because he trusted her judgment and expertise? How many signs had he missed because he was so grateful to have found someone who seemed to love his daughter as much as he did? Robert realized that he was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life, and more importantly, the rest of Emma's childhood. Every decision he made in the next few minutes would echo through their future together, and he could not afford to make the wrong choice. That evening, after Victoria had reluctantly allowed Emma to have dinner with them, Robert watched his daughter with growing alarm. Emma ate in complete silence, mechanically cutting her food into small, precise pieces and chewing each bite exactly 15 times before swallowing. When Victoria asked her to pass the salt, Emma responded with a barely audible, "Yes, ma'am," and immediately complied, her movements careful and measured. This was not his daughter. Emma had always been a chatterbox at dinner, sharing stories about her day, asking questions about everything from why clouds were white to how tall buildings stayed standing. She would laugh at Robert's silly jokes and sometimes forget her table manners in her excitement to tell him about a new book or a friend at school. The silent, subdued child sitting across from him bore little resemblance to the vibrant little girl he had left 3 weeks ago. After dinner, Victoria announced that Emma needed to go to bed early as part of her new routine. Robert started to protest, mentioning that it was only 7 o'clock and Emma usually stayed up until 8:30, but Victoria gave him a sharp look and reminded him that consistency was crucial for children who were struggling with behavioral issues. "Kiss Daddy goodnight, Emma," Victoria instructed, her tone sweet but somehow commanding. Emma stood up from her chair with the same careful precision she had shown all evening. She walked around the table to Robert and gave him a brief, awkward hug that felt nothing like the enthusiastic embraces he remembered. As she pulled away, she whispered something so quietly that he almost missed it. "Help me, Daddy." The words were barely audible, spoken so softly that Victoria, who was clearing dishes from the table, didn't hear them. But Robert heard them clearly, and they hit him like a physical blow. His sweet, trusting daughter was asking for help in her own home, from someone she should be able to count on, absolutely. Robert watched as Victoria escorted Emma upstairs, noting how his daughter walked with her eyes downcast and her shoulders slightly hunched, as if she was trying to make herself invisible. When they reached the top of the stairs, he heard Victoria's voice, still saccharine, but with an underlying edge that made his skin crawl. Alone in the dining room, Robert tried to process what he had witnessed. Every interaction between Victoria and Emma had felt rehearsed, as if they were both playing roles in a script that only Victoria had read. His daughter's natural spontaneity and joy had been replaced by a careful compliance that spoke of fear rather than respect. Over the next hour, Robert found reasons to move around the house, listening for sounds from upstairs. What he heard disturbed him even more. Victoria's voice carried down the hallway in a constant stream of criticism and instruction. Emma was apparently not brushing her teeth correctly, not organizing her clothes properly, not sitting up straight enough while Victoria read to her. The bedtime story, which should have been a comforting ritual, sounded more like an interrogation. When Victoria finally came downstairs, she immediately launched into an explanation of how important it was to establish clear expectations and consequences for children. She spoke about Emma's adjustment issues and attention-seeking behaviors with the confidence of someone who had dealt with such problems many times before. "I know this seems harsh," Victoria said, settling beside Robert on the sofa, "but trust me, this approach works. I've seen dramatic improvements in children who initially resisted structure. Emma will thank us for this guidance when she's older and more mature." Robert found himself nodding along, but internally, every word Victoria spoke felt wrong. This was his daughter they were discussing, not some troubled child from a textbook. Emma had never needed harsh discipline or rigid structure. She had thrived on love, encouragement, and gentle guidance. "Tell me more about Dr. Morrison," Robert said carefully. "I'd like to speak with him about Emma's treatment plan." Victoria's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Oh, he's very busy with his practice. I'm sure he'd be happy to send you some literature about his methods, though. Many parents find it helpful to understand the psychological principles behind behavioral modification." Something about the way Victoria avoided giving him concrete information about this doctor raised red flags in Robert's mind. In his business dealings, he had learned to be suspicious of people who couldn't provide specific details about their claims. Victoria was being evasive, and he wanted to know why. The next morning, after Victoria left for what she claimed was the appointment with the Richmond Historical Society, Robert made his first real attempt to understand what had been happening in his home. He started by talking to Emma, who was sitting in the breakfast nook with a bowl of oatmeal that she was eating with the same mechanical precision he had observed the night before. "Emma, sweetheart," he said gently, sitting down across from her. "Daddy wants to talk to you about how you've been feeling lately." Emma's spoon paused halfway to her mouth, and she glanced nervously toward the stairs, as if expecting Victoria to appear at any moment. "Mama Victoria says I'm not supposed to bother you with my problems," Emma whispered. "She says successful daddies like you have too many important things to think about." Robert felt anger rising in his chest. He had never, not once in Emma's entire life, suggested that her problems or feelings were unimportant to him. The idea that Victoria would tell his daughter such a thing was both heartbreaking and infuriating. "Emma, look at me," Robert said softly. When she raised her eyes to meet his, he continued, "You are the most important thing in Daddy's whole world. Nothing is more important to me than how you feel and what you need. Do you understand that?" Tears began to well up in Emma's eyes, and Robert realized that she had been holding back emotions for far longer than just the 3 weeks he had been away. The careful control she had been maintaining began to crack, and she started to tell him about the rules Victoria had implemented, the constant corrections and criticisms, the way she was made to sit in corners for infractions as minor as humming while she colored. As Emma spoke, Robert began to understand that Victoria had been systematically breaking down his daughter's natural confidence and joy. Every creative impulse, every moment of childish exuberance had been labeled as misbehavior that needed to be corrected. Emma had been taught that her natural personality was wrong and that she needed to suppress every aspect of herself that didn't fit Victoria's narrow definition of acceptable behavior. The most disturbing revelation came when Emma described the notebooks Victoria kept, filled with detailed records of Emma's supposed infractions and the punishments that had been administered. Victoria had been documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone conducting an experiment, as if Emma was a subject to be studied rather than a child to be loved. After Emma's revelations, Robert called his office and cleared his schedule for the rest of the week. He needed time to investigate the woman he had brought into their lives and to understand the full extent of what his daughter had endured. He started by trying to verify Victoria's claims about Dr. Morrison and the behavioral clinic. But when he called every child psychology practice in Richmond, none of them had ever heard of a Dr. Morrison who specialized in behavioral modification. This discovery led Robert to question everything else Victoria had told him about her background and qualifications. He realized that in his grief over his wife's passing and his gratitude for finding someone who seemed to care for Emma, he had never thoroughly investigated Victoria's past. He had accepted her stories about her education and experience at face value, trusting her because she seemed so knowledgeable and caring. Now, armed with the name of the university where Victoria claimed to have studied child psychology, Robert began making phone calls that would reveal the first cracks in the carefully constructed facade that had fooled him for 2 years. The phone call to Virginia Commonwealth University's psychology department shattered Robert's remaining illusions about the woman he had planned to marry. After being transferred through 3 different offices, he finally spoke with Dr. Sarah Chen, the department head, who informed him that they had no record of a Victoria Whitmore ever being enrolled in their graduate program. "Are you certain?" Robert asked, his voice tight with growing dread. "She would have graduated about 6 years ago with a master's in child psychology." "I've been here for 12 years, Mr. Harrison," Dr. Chen replied kindly. "I personally review all our graduate applications and know every student who has come through our program. We've never had a Victoria Whitmore, and in fact, we don't offer a specialized master's program in child psychology. Our graduate degrees are in general clinical psychology with various concentration areas." Robert thanked Dr. Chen and hung up the phone with shaking hands. If Victoria had lied about her educational background, what else had she fabricated? He thought about all the times she had spoken knowledgeably about child development theories, citing specific researchers and studies with such confidence that he had never questioned her expertise. Emma was at school, and Victoria was still out, giving Robert the opportunity to search for evidence of who Victoria really was. He started in their bedroom, going through her personal belongings, with the systematic thoroughness that had served him well in complex construction projects. In her jewelry box, hidden beneath a false bottom that he discovered by accident, he found something that made his blood run cold. There were 3 different driver's licenses, each with Victoria's photograph but bearing different names: Victoria Whitmore, Victoria Caldwell, and Victoria Sterling. The addresses were from different states: Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, and the licenses were issued at different times over the past 5 years. None of them appeared to be forgeries. They looked completely authentic. Beneath the licenses was a small leather journal filled with Victoria's handwriting. As Robert read the entries, he realized he was looking at detailed notes about his family. There were observations about Emma's personality, her fears, her favorite foods, and her daily routines. But these weren't the loving observations of a stepmother getting to know her new daughter. They were cold clinical assessments written with the detachment of a scientist studying a laboratory subject. One entry, dated just 2 weeks after Victoria had moved in with them, was particularly chilling. Subject responds well to positive reinforcement, but shows strong attachment to father figure. Dependency on father's approval could be exploited to modify behaviors. Recommend gradual separation of father-daughter bond to establish primary authority. Robert felt sick as he read page after page of calculated observations about his daughter. Victoria had been studying Emma from the moment she entered their lives, looking for weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could be manipulated. The woman he had thought was falling in love with his daughter had actually been planning how to control and dominate her. Near the back of the journal, Robert found what appeared to be contact information for other men. Names like David C., Atlanta, widower, 6-year-old son, and Michael R. Charlotte, divorced, twin daughters aged 7, were listed alongside phone numbers and brief notes about each family's circumstances. It was becoming clear that Robert and Emma were not Victoria's first targets. The sound of a car in the driveway sent Robert into a panic. He quickly photographed the most damaging pages of the journal with his phone, replaced everything exactly as he had found it, and managed to get downstairs just as Victoria's key turned in the front door. "Hello, darling," Victoria called out in her usual warm tone. "How has your day been? I hope you and Emma had some good father-daughter time." Robert forced himself to smile and respond normally, but every word Victoria spoke now sounded different to his ears. He could hear the calculation behind her warmth, the way she carefully monitored his reactions to gauge whether her performance was convincing. How had he missed this before? How had he been so completely fooled by someone who was clearly a skilled manipulator? That afternoon, while Victoria was preparing dinner, Robert made a series of phone calls that would change everything. He contacted a private investigator named James Bradley, a former police detective who specialized in background investigations for high-profile clients. Robert explained that he needed urgent information about Victoria Whitmore and provided the other names from the driver's licenses. "I can have preliminary information for you by tomorrow morning," Bradley assured him. "If she's been using multiple identities, there will be a trail. People like this often leave a pattern of damaged relationships and legal issues behind them." The wait until Bradley's call the next morning was the longest night of Robert's life. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Victoria's quiet breathing beside him and wondering how many other families she had destroyed. Every gentle word she murmured in her sleep, every unconscious movement, now seemed sinister and threatening. Emma came to his mind constantly throughout the sleepless night. His brave, bright little girl had been living with this psychological predator for 2 years, enduring systematic emotional manipulation designed to break down her spirit and independence. The guilt Robert felt was overwhelming. He was supposed to protect his daughter, and instead, he had invited her tormentor into their home and given her complete access to the most precious person in his world. When Bradley called the next morning, the news was even worse than Robert had feared. Victoria's real name was Victoria Ann Caldwell, and she had a history of targeting single fathers with young children across the southeastern United States. In Tennessee, she had been involved with a man named David Chambers for 8 months before his ex-wife had threatened legal action over the way Victoria was treating David's 6-year-old son. The mother claimed that Victoria was psychologically abusing the child, Bradley explained over the phone. She alleged that Victoria was using isolation techniques and emotional manipulation to control the boy's behavior. The case never went to court because Victoria disappeared before it could be resolved. In North Carolina, Victoria had been engaged to a widower named Michael Rodriguez. That relationship had ended abruptly when Michael's twin daughters had been found hiding in their school counselor's office, too afraid to go home. The counselor had reported signs of psychological distress in both children, including regression in behavior and academic performance. "The pattern is consistent," Bradley continued. "She targets men who are emotionally vulnerable due to divorce or the loss of a spouse. She presents herself as educated and experienced with children, gains the father's trust, and then systematically begins breaking down the children's emotional well-being. It appears to be some form of psychological disorder that compels her to dominate and control vulnerable children." Robert asked the question that terrified him most. "Has she ever been prosecuted for what she's done?" "That's the problem," Bradley replied. "She's very careful never to cross lines that would result in clear legal violations. The emotional manipulation she uses is sophisticated and leaves no physical evidence. By the time the fathers realize what's happening, she's usually already moved on to her next target. She's managed to stay just within the boundaries of what's legally actionable." As Robert absorbed this information, he realized that he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than he had imagined. Victoria wasn't just a bad stepmother or someone with poor judgment about child rearing. She was a predator who had spent years perfecting her techniques for finding and exploiting vulnerable families. The most disturbing revelation came when Bradley told him about a family in Georgia where Victoria had stayed for over a year. The father finally realized what was happening and confronted her. She attempted to turn his 7-year-old daughter against him by convincing the child that her father didn't really love her and was planning to send her away. It took months of therapy for that little girl to rebuild her trust in her father. Robert closed his eyes and thought about Emma's whispered plea for help at dinner 2 nights ago. How long had his daughter been suffering in silence, believing that her father either didn't notice her distress or didn't care enough to intervene? The thought that Emma might doubt his love for her was more painful than anything he had ever experienced. Bradley's final piece of information provided the key Robert needed to protect his daughter. There's a warrant out for Victoria Caldwell in Tennessee related to identity fraud charges. If you can confirm her identity through those driver's licenses you found, we can have her arrested immediately. Robert knew what he had to do. The woman sleeping in his bed, eating at his table, and systematically destroying his daughter's emotional well-being was about to face the consequences of her actions. But first, he needed to make sure Emma was safe, and that Victoria could never hurt another child again. Robert's hands trembled as he ended the call with Detective Susan Martinez from the Richmond Police Department. After seeing the evidence Bradley had uncovered and the photographs of the multiple driver's licenses, Detective Martinez had confirmed that Victoria Ann Caldwell was indeed wanted in Tennessee on charges of identity fraud and had agreed to issue a warrant for her arrest in Virginia. "We'll need to coordinate this carefully, Mr. Harrison," Detective Martinez had explained. "If she feels cornered, there's no telling how she might react. Our primary concern is the safety of your daughter." The plan they developed was simple but crucial. Robert would ensure that Emma was safely away from the house when the arrest took place. He arranged for his sister Margaret to pick Emma up from school that afternoon and take her to her house in nearby Henrico County, telling Emma only that they were having an impromptu sleepover with her cousins. As Robert waited for Victoria to return from her afternoon errands, he found himself walking through the house and seeing it with completely new eyes. The cheerful yellow kitchen, where Victoria had prepared countless meals, now felt like a stage set designed to create an illusion of domestic happiness. The family photographs on the mantelpiece, which included several pictures of Victoria with Emma, now looked like evidence of a carefully orchestrated deception. He thought about all the times Victoria had spoken lovingly about Emma's progress, praising her for becoming more mature and better behaved. Robert now understood that what Victoria had called maturity was actually the systematic suppression of his daughter's natural personality. Emma's joy, creativity, and spontaneity had been labeled as problems to be solved rather than gifts to be celebrated. The sound of Victoria's car pulling into the driveway snapped Robert back to the present. He positioned himself in the living room where he could see both the front door and the staircase, wanting to control the setting for what would be the most important conversation of his life. Victoria entered the house with her usual bright smile, carrying shopping bags from the local department store. "Hello, darling," she called out, setting down her packages and moving toward Robert for their customary greeting kiss. "I found the most adorable dress for Emma at the children's boutique. It's in navy blue, very sophisticated. I thought it would be perfect for teaching her about appropriate attire for young ladies." The casual way Victoria spoke about continuing to control Emma's clothing choices, even her appearance, made Robert's stomach turn. He stepped back before Victoria could reach him, and something in his expression made her pause. "Is everything all right?" Victoria asked, her voice taking on a note of concern that Robert now recognized as carefully calculated. "You look upset about something." "We need to talk," Robert said simply. "Sit down, Victoria. Or should I call you Victoria Caldwell? Or perhaps you prefer Victoria Sterling?" The transformation in Victoria's face was instantaneous and complete. The warm, caring expression that Robert had fallen in love with vanished, replaced by something cold and predatory. Her posture straightened, and her eyes became sharp and calculating, like a wild animal that had been cornered and was assessing its options. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria said, but her voice had lost its gentle quality and now carried a hard edge that Robert had never heard before. Robert pulled out his phone and showed her the photographs he had taken of the driver's licenses and journal entries. "I know exactly who you are, and what you've been doing to my daughter. I know about David Chambers in Tennessee, Michael Rodriguez in North Carolina, and all the other families you've destroyed." Victoria stared at the phone screen for a long moment, and Robert could almost see her mind working, calculating her next move. When she looked up at him again, the mask had completely fallen away, revealing the true person underneath. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Victoria said, her voice now completely devoid of warmth. "Emma was a broken child when I came into her life, spoiled, undisciplined, emotionally unstable from losing her mother. I was helping her become a better person, teaching her self-control and respect. You were systematically destroying her spirit," Robert replied, his anger finally breaking through his careful control. "You took a happy, confident child and turned her into a frightened shadow of herself. You made her afraid to laugh, afraid to be creative, afraid to be a child." Victoria laughed, and the sound was nothing like the gentle laughter Robert remembered. It was harsh and mocking, filled with contempt. "You men are all the same. You want to be the hero, the rescuer, but you're too weak to do what's actually necessary to raise a properly behaved child. Emma needed structure and discipline, not the permissive nonsense you call parenting. Emma needed love and acceptance," Robert shot back. "She needed to know that she was valued for who she is, not criticized for every natural impulse she had." "Love is worthless without respect," Victoria snapped. "Children need to learn their place in the world, and Emma was learning hers very well until you decided to interfere. Do you think she'll thank you for this? Do you think she'll be better off when she's older and has no self-discipline or respect for authority?" Robert stared at this stranger who had been living in his house for 2 years, realizing that Victoria genuinely believed her own twisted logic. In her mind, she was not an abuser but a teacher, not a manipulator but a guide. The complete absence of empathy or understanding in her words was more chilling than any outright threat could have been. "Where is Emma?" Victoria demanded suddenly, as if just realizing that the house was too quiet. "She should be home from school by now." "She's somewhere safe," Robert replied. "Somewhere you'll never hurt her again." Victoria's eyes flashed with fury, and for a moment Robert saw something truly dangerous in her expression. "You can't keep her from me forever. She needs proper guidance, and I'm the only one qualified to provide it. I've invested 2 years in that child's development, and I'm not going to let you ruin all of our progress." The possessive way Victoria spoke about Emma, as if his daughter was a project she owned rather than a human being with her own rights and feelings, made Robert's skin crawl. He realized that in Victoria's twisted worldview, she genuinely saw herself as Emma's rightful guardian and him as an obstacle to be overcome. "Your progress?" Robert repeated. "You call breaking down a child's self-confidence progress? You call making her afraid to express herself progress? I call teaching her self-control and appropriate behavior progress," Victoria replied coldly. "Something you clearly never learned how to do. Emma was becoming a proper young lady under my guidance, and now you're going to turn her back into an undisciplined brat." The sound of cars pulling up outside interrupted their confrontation. Robert looked out the window and saw 2 police cruisers in his driveway, along with Detective Martinez's unmarked sedan. Victoria followed his gaze and immediately understood what was happening. "You called the police," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "You actually called the police on me for trying to help your daughter become a better person." "I called the police on you for psychological abuse and identity fraud," Robert corrected. "And for whatever you did to those other children in Tennessee and North Carolina." Victoria turned to face him fully, and Robert saw something in her eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't fear or anger or even hatred. It was complete and utter contempt, as if he was something beneath her notice. "You have no idea what you've done," Victoria said quietly. "Emma was just beginning to reach her potential under my guidance. She was learning self-discipline, respect, and proper behavior. Now you're going to let her revert to being a wild, undisciplined child who will never amount to anything. The doorbell rang, but Victoria made no move toward the door. Instead, she continued staring at Robert with that cold, contemptuous expression. "You think you're protecting her," Victoria continued, "but you're actually destroying her future. In 10 years, when Emma is struggling with discipline problems and behavioral issues, remember this moment. Remember that you chose to remove the one person who could have helped her become something worthwhile." Detective Martinez's authoritative voice called through the door. "Richmond Police, please open the door." Robert walked to the front door, leaving Victoria standing alone in the living room. As he opened the door to let the officers in, he heard Victoria's voice one last time, still cold and unrepentant. "This isn't over, Robert. Emma needs proper guidance, and one day she'll realize that I was the only one who truly understood what was best for her." 3 weeks after Victoria's arrest, Robert sat in Dr. Jennifer Walsh's office, watching through the one-way window as Emma played with art supplies in the adjoining therapy room. Dr. Walsh was a genuine child psychologist recommended by Emma's pediatrician, who specialized in helping children recover from psychological manipulation. "The healing process will take time," Dr. Walsh explained gently. "Emma has been conditioned to suppress her natural personality for 2 years. She's essentially forgotten how to be herself without fear of consequences." Robert watched as Emma carefully arranged crayons in perfect rows before beginning to draw, and his heart ached. Even in this safe space, his daughter still exhibited the rigid, controlled behavior that Victoria had demanded. Every movement was precise and measured, as if she was constantly monitoring herself for potential mistakes. But there had been small signs of progress. 2 days earlier, Emma had laughed at one of Robert's silly jokes during breakfast, then immediately looked around nervously as if expecting to be corrected. When Robert had told her that laughter was wonderful and that he loved hearing her joy, Emma had seemed genuinely surprised. "She keeps asking if she's in trouble," Robert told Dr. Walsh. "Yesterday, she spilled a glass of milk and immediately started crying, saying she was sorry over and over again. It broke my heart." Dr. Walsh nodded understandingly. Victoria conditioned Emma to believe that normal childhood accidents and behaviors were serious infractions. It will take time for Emma to understand that making mistakes is part of being human, especially for children. The legal proceedings against Victoria had revealed the full extent of her deception. She had indeed been using multiple identities to evade accountability for her actions, moving from state to state and family to family whenever her behavior was questioned. The prosecutor had called her a sophisticated psychological predator who targeted the most vulnerable members of society. Detective Martinez had informed Robert that Victoria would likely face charges in multiple states with sentences that could total 20 years in prison. While Robert felt no sympathy for Victoria, he was grateful that she would not be able to hurt other children while she was incarcerated. The most difficult part of Emma's recovery was helping her understand that none of what had happened was her fault. Victoria had been so skilled at making Emma believe that she was responsible for every punishment and criticism that the little girl had internalized a deep sense of guilt and self-blame. "Daddy," Emma had asked just the night before, "was I really a bad girl? Is that why Mama Victoria had to teach me so many rules?" Robert had knelt down to Emma's eye level and spoken to her with all the love and conviction he could muster. "Emma, you were never a bad girl, not for one single day of your life. Mama Victoria was the one who was wrong, not you. You are perfect exactly the way you are." But even as Emma nodded and seemed to accept his words, Robert could see the doubt in her eyes. Victoria's psychological manipulation had been so thorough that Emma's trust in her own goodness had been systematically destroyed. "Doctor, Walsh had recommended that Robert make their home environment as different as possible from the rigid structure Victoria had imposed. The goal was to help Emma remember what it felt like to be a free, creative, joyful child. Robert had enthusiastically embraced this approach, sometimes feeling as if he was rediscovering his own daughter. He had removed all the rules charts and behavioral monitoring systems that Victoria had created. The corner chairs, where Emma had been forced to sit for reflection time, were donated to charity. Victoria's notebooks full of criticism and observations were destroyed in a ceremonial bonfire in the backyard, with Emma watching and asking questions about why someone would write such mean things about a little girl. Slowly, tentatively, Emma was beginning to show glimpses of her old self. She had started humming again while she colored, though she still stopped abruptly when she realized she was doing it. She had asked if she could wear her favorite bright pink dress instead of the subdued colors Victoria had preferred. Most importantly, she had begun asking questions again, starting with tentative inquiries about whether it was okay to be curious about things. "Can I ask you about your work, Daddy?" she had whispered one morning. Mama Victoria said successful people don't like to be bothered with questions. Robert had spent the next hour telling Emma all about his construction projects, watching her eyes light up with genuine interest as he described how buildings were designed and built. Her natural curiosity and intelligence, which Victoria had labeled as bothersome and inappropriate, were slowly beginning to resurface. The breakthrough moment came during Emma's fourth session with Dr. Walsh. Robert was observing from the adjoining room when Emma suddenly threw down her crayons and began to cry. "I don't want to color perfectly anymore," Emma sobbed. "I want to color outside the lines and make purple trees and orange grass. I want to make messy, happy pictures." Dr. Walsh smiled and handed Emma a fresh piece of paper. "Then let's make the messiest, happiest picture we can think of." Robert watched through tears as his daughter began to create with abandon for the first time in months. Her drawing was chaotic and colorful, full of fantastical creatures and impossible landscapes. It was the most beautiful artwork he had ever seen because it was purely, joyfully Emma. After the session, Emma ran to Robert with her creation, her face glowing with pride and excitement. "Look, Daddy. I made a picture of a magical forest where all the animals are friends and they have parties every day." Robert hugged his daughter tightly, feeling as if a part of her that had been lost was finally coming home. "It's the most wonderful picture I've ever seen," he said honestly. "Should we put it on the refrigerator?" Emma's eyes widened with surprise and delight. "Really? We can put it on the refrigerator?" Mama Victoria said children's artwork was too messy for the kitchen. "Our refrigerator is going to be covered with your beautiful artwork," Robert promised. "In fact, I think we need a whole wall just for displaying your creations." That evening, Robert kept his promise. He cleared space on the kitchen wall and hung Emma's drawing in a place of honor, along with several other pictures she had made in the past few days. Emma stood in front of her impromptu art gallery, her face shining with pride and happiness. "Daddy," she said quietly, "I think I'm starting to remember how to be Emma again." Robert's vision blurred with tears of joy and relief. "You never stopped being Emma, sweetheart. You just had to keep her hidden for a while to stay safe, but now she can come out and play whenever she wants." As the weeks passed, Robert began to see more and more of his real daughter emerging from the shell that Victoria's manipulation had created. Emma started singing again, making up elaborate stories about her stuffed animals and asking endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to how airplanes stayed up in the air. The most significant change was in Emma's relationship with Robert himself. Victoria had worked systematically to create distance between father and daughter, making Emma believe that her father was too busy and important to be bothered with her needs. Now, Emma was rediscovering the security and joy of having a parent who was completely devoted to her happiness and well-being. "I love you more than all the stars in the sky," Robert told her one night as he tucked her into bed. "Even when I'm messy and loud and ask too many questions," Emma asked, still needing reassurance. "Especially when you're messy and loud and ask too many questions," Robert replied. "That's when you're being the most perfectly Emma." Doctor Walsh had warned Robert that recovery from psychological manipulation was not a straight line, and there would likely be setbacks and difficult days ahead. But seeing Emma's natural joy and curiosity beginning to return gave Robert hope that his daughter would not only recover from this experience, but might even emerge stronger and more resilient. The house itself seemed to be coming back to life. Where once there had been oppressive silence and rigid order, now there was laughter and music and the comfortable chaos of a child being allowed to be a child. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator and spilled onto the walls. Her books were scattered throughout the house, wherever she had last been reading. Her dress-up clothes created colorful trails from her bedroom to the living room, where she performed elaborate plays for her stuffed animal audience. Most importantly, Emma was beginning to trust her own instincts again. She was learning that her natural impulses toward creativity, curiosity, and joy were not character flaws to be corrected, but gifts to be celebrated. 1 year later, Robert stood in his transformed home office, no longer the sterile space where Victoria had conducted her psychological experiments on Emma, but a warm, welcoming room filled with family photographs, Emma's artwork, and the manuscript that had consumed his evenings for the past 6 months. The idea to write a book had come from Emma herself. During one of their evening talks, she had asked if other children had experienced what she went through with Victoria. When Robert explained that unfortunately some children did face similar challenges, Emma had grown thoughtful. "Daddy," she had said with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from children who have faced difficult circumstances, "maybe we should tell our story so other kids know they're not alone. And so daddies and mummies know what to watch for." The book, titled Finding Emma Again, A Father and Daughter's Journey from Manipulation to Healing, had become more than Robert had ever imagined. What started as a simple account of their experience had evolved into a comprehensive guide for parents about recognizing psychological manipulation, supporting children through recovery, and rebuilding trust and confidence. Emma had insisted on being involved in the writing process, contributing her own perspective in a special section written in her 8-year-old voice. Her chapter, What I Want Other Kids to Know, had moved their editor to tears and was being praised by child psychologists as one of the most authentic accounts of psychological recovery ever written by a child. "I want kids to know that when grown-ups are mean to you, it's not because you're bad," Emma had dictated to Robert as he typed her words. "It's because they have something broken inside them that makes them want to hurt people. And I want them to know that there are good grown-ups who will help you remember how wonderful you really are." The book's publication had led to speaking engagements at conferences for child welfare professionals, interviews with parenting magazines, and most meaningfully, letters from families who had recognized warning signs in their own situations after reading advance copies. One letter from a single mother in Oregon had been particularly moving. "Your book helped me realize that my boyfriend's discipline methods with my 5-year-old daughter were actually psychological manipulation. Thanks to your story, I found the courage to end that relationship and get help for my daughter. We're both healing now, and I wanted you to know that sharing your story probably saved my child's emotional well-being. But the most significant transformation had been in their own home. The house that had once felt oppressive and controlled had become a place of joy, creativity, and unconditional love. Robert had renovated the basement, turning it into a bright, cheerful playroom where Emma could be as messy and creative as she wanted. The walls were covered with her ever-changing art gallery, and comfortable reading nooks filled every corner. More importantly, the playroom had become a gathering place for other children whose families had been touched by their story. Emma had become something of a mentor to younger children who were working through their own experiences with psychological manipulation or other traumas. Her natural empathy and resilience made her uniquely qualified to help other kids understand that healing was possible. Emma has an extraordinary gift for connecting with children who have been hurt. Dr. Walsh had observed during one of their sessions, she's living proof that children can not only recover from psychological manipulation, but can emerge stronger and more compassionate. The informal support network that had grown around their family included several other single parents who had faced similar challenges. Every other weekend, their home hosted what Emma called healing parties, where children and parents alike could share their experiences in a safe, supportive environment. Sarah Chen, the mother of 6-year-old twins who had escaped a situation similar to theirs, had become one of Robert's closest friends. Her daughters, Lucy and Sophie, adored Emma and looked up to her as a big sister figure who understood what they had experienced. "Emma saved my girls," Sarah had told Robert just the week before. "They were so withdrawn and fearful when we left Derek. But watching Emma be joyful and confident again showed them that they could heal too." Robert's business had also been transformed by his experience. Harrison Construction had established a foundation that built and renovated safe spaces for organizations that worked with traumatized children. Robert had discovered that using his professional skills to create healing environments was more fulfilling than any commercial project he had ever undertaken. The Foundation's first major project had been renovating the children's wing of the Richmond Crisis Center, creating bright, welcoming spaces where children could feel safe while receiving counseling and support services. Emma had been involved in the design process, insisting that there be cozy reading corners and walls where children could display their artwork. "Every child should have a place where they can be proud of their creations," Emma had explained to the architects. "Art helps you remember who you really are inside." The success of their book had brought opportunities that Robert had never expected. Publishers were interested in a follow-up book. Television producers wanted to adapt their story for a documentary, and speaking bureaus were booking them for events across the country. But for Robert, the greatest measure of their success was much simpler. Emma's laughter filled their home again. The little girl, who had once been afraid to express joy, now sang at the top of her lungs, told elaborate stories about her imaginary adventures, and asked so many questions that Robert sometimes jokingly complained about getting writer's cramp from taking notes. "Daddy," Emma said one evening as they sat together in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, "do you think Mama Victoria will ever get better? Do you think she'll learn how to love kids the right way?" Robert considered his answer carefully. Even after everything they had been through, Emma's capacity for compassion continued to amaze him. "I don't know, sweetheart. Some people have hurt inside them that's very hard to heal, but you know what I do know?" "What?" Emma asked, leaning against his shoulder. "I know that, because of what we've been through, we're going to help lots of other families stay safe and heal if they need to. We turn something really hard into something that helps people." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Like making a beautiful garden out of dirt that used to have weeds in it." "Exactly like that," Robert agreed, marveling once again at his daughter's wisdom and resilience. As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, Robert reflected on how far they had traveled from that terrible day when he had discovered Emma sitting in forced silence in his study. The journey had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had led them to a deeper understanding of love, resilience, and the incredible strength that could emerge from facing challenges together. Emma had not only recovered from her experience with Victoria, she had become a beacon of hope for other children facing similar struggles. Her story was proof that children could heal from psychological manipulation and that with proper support and unconditional love, they could even transform their pain into purpose. The book's final chapter ended with words that Emma had insisted on writing herself. If you're a kid who's going through something scary with a grown-up who's supposed to take care of you, remember that it's not your fault and it won't last forever. There are people who will help you, and someday you might help other kids too. The most important thing to remember is that you are wonderful exactly the way you are, and nothing anyone does to you can change that. You just have to remember to let your real self shine again. As Robert tucked Emma into bed that night, she looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with the confidence and joy that Victoria had tried so hard to extinguish. "Daddy, I'm glad we wrote our book. I think it's going to help lots of families find their way back to each other." "I think so too, sweetheart. And I'm proud of how brave you were to share your story." Emma smiled sleepily. "I love you, Daddy. Thank you for saving me and for helping me remember how to be Emma again." "I love you too, Emma. More than all the stars in the sky." As Robert turned off the light and quietly closed Emma's bedroom door, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this place of healing and hope. Their story was proof that even in the darkest circumstances, love could triumph, families could heal, and purpose could emerge from pain. The little girl who had once whispered, "Help me," in fear and desperation, was now a confident, joyful child whose own voice was helping other families find their way to safety and healing. And that transformation, Robert knew, was the greatest victory of all.